Sometimes life kicks you when you're already down, and all you can do is keep standing. Dean Halpern knew that feeling well at 55, he'd lost his job, his savings were running dry, and his daughter barely returned his calls anymore. One afternoon at the county fair, he bought a $5 raffle ticket for an old abandoned farm, not because he thought he'd win, but because he had nothing better to do. When they called his name, people laughed. The farm was a wreck. Everyone knew it. But Dean took the keys anyway. When he walked into that dusty farmhouse and started looking around, he found something hidden in the walls, something that would change everything. What was buried in that forgotten place? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Dean Halpern had never expected much from life, and for the most part, life had returned the favor. At 55, he lived in a one-bedroom apartment on the east side of Millerton, a town of 3,200 souls nestled in farm country where the highways didn't bother to stop. The apartment was clean but sparse, a couch he'd bought used 7 years ago, a small television, a kitchen table with one chair. He'd sold the other 3 chairs last winter when the heating bill came due. The warehouse job had been his anchor for 25 years. Midland Distribution Center, loading and unloading trucks, managing inventory, the kind of honest work that paid the bills and asked nothing more than showing up on time. When they closed the facility and moved operations 2 states over, Dean got a handshake, a severance check that barely lasted 3 months, and a form letter thanking him for his service. That was 6 months ago. Since then, he'd applied to 42 jobs. He kept count in a notebook, each rejection adding to the tally. Too old, too experienced, not experienced, enough in the right areas, the reasons varied, but the outcome never did. His daughter Bryn used to call every Sunday. Then it became every other Sunday. Now it was whenever she remembered, which wasn't often. She was 32, working in pharmaceutical sales 3 hours away in the city, busy with a career that demanded everything. Dean understood. He'd raised her alone after his wife passed, worked double shifts to pay for her college, watched her walk across that graduation stage with pride that nearly broke his chest open. She'd done exactly what he'd hoped made something of herself, escaped the small-town gravity that pulled so many back. But somewhere in that success, they'd lost the easy conversations. Phone calls became status updates, visits became holidays, then just Christmas, then excuses about work obligations. Dean told himself it was natural, that parents and adult children drifted, that he should be proud she didn't need him anymore. He told himself that, but it didn't make the apartment feel less empty. The county fair had been running for 93 years, held every September in the field behind the high school. Dean went because it was something to do, a way to fill the hours that seemed to multiply, now that work no longer structured his days. He wandered past the craft booths and the 4-H displays, watched families with children chasing each other between the rides, felt his invisibility like a weight. At the volunteer fire department booth, Floyd Hutchins was selling raffle tickets. Floyd had worked at the warehouse too, retired 5 years back with a pension and a satisfied smile. He waved Dean over with the enthusiasm of someone who had nowhere else to be and was happy about it. "$1 a ticket, 5 for $5, Floyd said, gesturing to the prize board behind him. "Got some good stuff this year." Randy Kowalski donated a new grill, Betty's putting up a quilt, and the county's offering that old Keswick place out on rural Route 12. Dean studied the board. The farm was listed as the grand prize, which seemed generous until you knew anything about it. Virgil Keswick had died 5 years ago. Some said it was a heart attack. Others claimed he'd simply given up, and the property had passed to the county when no heirs came forward. The house was falling apart, the barn sagging, the fields overgrown. Dean had driven past it once or twice. It looked like a place where hope went to die. $5, Dean heard himself say. He pulled a crumpled bill from his wallet, one of the last until his unemployment check came through. Floyd handed him 5 tickets with numbers printed in faded blue ink. "Good luck, Dean. Maybe you'll win that farm. Fix it up nice." Dean smiled because it was expected, pocketed the tickets, and walked away. He didn't believe in luck, good or otherwise. Luck was for people who still thought the world owed them something. The drawing happened at 6 o'clock, after the pie judging and before the fireworks. Dean had planned to leave by then, but inertia kept him wandering the fairgrounds as the sun dropped toward the horizon. When the announcer's voice crackled over the speakers, he was sitting on a bench near the parking lot, watching a family pack their van with prizes and tired children. "And the grand prize winner is ticket number 47219. Dean Halpern." The name didn't register at first. Then it did, and Dean checked his tickets with hands that suddenly felt clumsy. The last ticket matched. He'd won. The walk back to the main tent felt longer than it should have. People stared as he approached the stage. The announcer, a round man named Jerry Stokes who ran the feed store, grinned broadly and held up a manila envelope. "Dean Halpern, come on up here." There was applause, but underneath it, Dean heard the whispers, the chuckling. Someone in the back said, "Poor bastard," and someone else laughed. Jerry handed him the envelope. It contained a deed, a set of keys, and a note about property taxes being current through the year. "Congratulations," Jerry said, shaking Dean's hand with theatrical enthusiasm. "You're now the proud owner of the old Keswick farm. 40 acres, house, barn, the whole works." More applause, more whispers. Dean took the envelope, thanked Jerry, and walked off the stage. As he passed through the crowd, he caught fragments of conversation. "Place is worthless. Roof's probably caved in by now. Keswick was always strange. That whole property's cursed, if you ask me." Dean didn't ask. He walked to his car, got in, and sat in the parking lot until the fairgrounds emptied and the fireworks painted the sky in colors that felt like they belonged to someone else's celebration. The next morning, Dean drove out to rural Route 12. The driveway was almost invisible, choked with weeds and saplings that scraped against his car. The house appeared gradually through the overgrowth, a 2-story farmhouse, with peeling white paint and shutters hanging at drunken angles. The barn listed to one side like a ship taking on water. Dean parked and got out. The silence was profound, broken only by wind moving through tall grass and the distant complaint of a crow. He walked to the front porch, tested the steps they held, and unlocked the door. Inside, dust covered everything like a shroud. The furniture was still there. A sofa with sunken cushions, a kitchen table, chairs pushed in as if someone had just left for a moment and never returned. The air smelled of abandonment and time, that particular mustiness of places where nothing living has disturbed the stillness for years. Dean walked through the rooms slowly. Upstairs, 2 bedrooms and a bathroom with a clawfoot tub. Downstairs, a kitchen with ancient appliances and a living room with a stone fireplace. At the back of the kitchen, he found a small mudroom, and beyond it, a door that led to the backyard and the barn. In the kitchen, drawer nearest the sink, Dean found a photograph, black and white, curled at the edges, showing a man in his 60s standing beside some kind of machine. The man had intelligent eyes and a slight smile, as if he knew something the camera didn't. On the back, someone had written in pencil, "V. Keswick, 2018. Dean studied the face. This was Virgil. Then the man who'd owned this place, who'd died here or near here, who'd left behind 40 acres of neglect that nobody wanted, except now Dean owned it. He owned this house, this land, this strange photograph of a stranger. He slipped the photo into his pocket and looked around the kitchen again. The place needed work. Everything needed work, but it had bones. Good bones, his wife would have said. She'd always seen potential where Dean saw problems. Standing in that dusty kitchen, with afternoon light slanting through dirty windows, Dean made a decision. He had nowhere else to go, nothing else to do, and an apartment lease that expired in 30 days. The farm was his, worthless or not. He might as well see what he'd won. That evening, Dean called Bryn. She answered on the fourth ring, sounding distracted. "Hey, Dad, what's up? I'm actually in the middle of something." "I won a farm," Dean said. A pause. "You what?" "At the county fair. I won a farm in a raffle." Another pause. Longer this time. "Dad, is it worth anything?" "Probably not, but I'm going to move there." "Move there?" "Dad, you can't be serious. You need to focus on finding work, not playing farmer." "I'm not playing anything. I'll figure out the work situation. I just wanted to let you know." He could hear her frustration, could picture her in her apartment with its modern furniture and its view of the city. "This seems really impulsive. Can we talk about this? Maybe I can drive down this weekend." "You don't need to do that. I'm fine. I'll call you once I'm settled." They said goodbye. Bryn still protesting, Dean already planning what to pack. After he hung up, he sat in his apartment and looked at the photograph of Virgil Keswick again. The man stared back across the years, that slight smile suggesting secrets Dean couldn't begin to guess. Dean moved into the farmhouse on a Tuesday, his entire life fitting into the back of his 12-year-old sedan. 3 boxes of clothes, a box of kitchen supplies, another of books and papers, and a duffel bag with his laptop and the few photographs he couldn't bear to leave behind. It took one trip from the car to the house, and when he set the last box down in the living room, the emptiness of the space seemed to mock the smallness of his possessions. He spent the first day cleaning. The work felt good, purposeful, measurable. He scrubbed counters, swept floors, wiped down windows until they let in light that hadn't touched these rooms in years. By evening, the house looked almost livable. He made a sandwich from the groceries he'd bought in town, ate it, standing at the kitchen counter, and watched the sun set over fields that now belonged to him. That night, the house spoke to him in creaks and groans, the language of old wood settling, of wind finding gaps in the siding, of a structure remembering what it meant to shelter someone. Dean lay in the upstairs bedroom on an air mattress he'd inflated with a hand pump, listening to the symphony of small sounds, and found it oddly comforting. The apartment had been silent, except for the muffled sounds of neighbors he never met. Here, the silence had texture. The second morning, he began exploring in earnest. The bedroom where he'd slept had a closet with wire hangers and a shelf holding folded linens that smelled of mothballs and time. The other bedroom was smaller, painted a faded yellow, empty except for a desk pushed against one wall. Dean opened the desk drawers one by one. The first 2 were empty. The third stuck, and when he worked it free, he found a leather-bound journal wedged at an angle. The journal, it was thick, the leather worn soft by handling. Dean carried it downstairs to the kitchen, where the light was better, poured himself coffee from the pot he'd made, and opened to the first page. The handwriting was precise, each letter carefully formed. The first entry was dated the 15th of March, 1995. "Started today on what might be the most important work of my life. They'll say I'm crazy, they already do, but I know this can work. The mathematics are sound, the principles are solid. What I lack in formal credentials, I make up for in stubbornness and time. Plenty of both." Dean turned pages, reading entries that spanned years. Virgil wrote about his work, about setbacks and small victories, about long nights in his workshop and the satisfaction of solving problems that had seemed impossible. The entries were technical in places, filled with equations and sketches that Dean didn't fully understand, but between the mathematics was something else, a voice. A man talking to himself, to the future, to anyone who might one day care. One entry, dated September 2003, caught Dean's attention. "Went to town today for supplies. Charlie at the hardware store gave me that look again, the one that says he thinks I'm wasting my time. Maybe I am, but when you've been laughed at as long as I have, you learn to use it as fuel. They laughed at me in school. They laughed when I told them I could fix anything. They're still laughing now that I'm trying to build something that matters. Let them laugh. "I'll keep working." Dean read the words twice, felt something shift in his chest. He knew that look. He'd seen it at the county fair, heard it in the whispers. The pity mixed with amusement, the dismissal that came so easily to people who'd never been dismissed themselves. He kept reading. The entries grew more focused as the years progressed, centered on something Virgil called the converter. He mentioned prototypes, tests, failures, adjustments. He wrote about the moment he realized he was close, really close, to something that could change lives. The last entry was dated November 2019, just months before Virgil died. "So tired now. The work is nearly done, but I'm running out of time. Can feel it in my bones, the way winter feels when you've lived through enough of them. If I don't finish, someone else will have to. The plans are all here. The pieces are all here. Just need someone who believes enough to put them together. That's all any of us need. Really, someone who believes." Dean closed the journal carefully, his coffee forgotten and cold. He looked around the kitchen, seeing it differently now. This wasn't just an abandoned house, it was Virgil's home. His workshop was here somewhere, and in it, the work of a lifetime waited for someone who believed enough to finish it. He thought about calling Bryn, telling her about the journal, but stopped himself. She'd already made her opinion clear. This was a distraction, a waste of time. Another example of her, a father refusing to face reality. She wouldn't understand that sometimes reality was exactly what you needed to escape. Instead, Dean took the journal and walked outside. The barn stood 50 yards from the house, its doors closed, its windows dark. He'd avoided it so far, put off by the visible decay. But now he walked toward it with purpose. The main doors were secured with a padlock crusted with rust. Dean tried the key ring that had come with the deed. The third key fit, and after some effort, the lock opened. He pulled the doors wide, and afternoon sunlight spilled into darkness. The barn was larger than it appeared from outside. The floor was concrete, cracked but mostly solid. Old hay bales were stacked along one wall. A tractor sat in the corner, tires flat, covered in dust. Tools hung on pegboards, their outlines visible even beneath years of cobwebs. At the back of the barn, behind a wall of hay bales that looked deliberately placed, Dean found another door. This one was secured with a newer padlock, and none of his keys fit. He searched the barn for something to break it with, found a heavy wrench, and struck the lock 3 times before it gave way. The door opened into a workshop that took Dean's breath away. Workbenches lined 3 walls, their surfaces covered with tools, organized with obvious care. Blueprints were tacked to the walls, dozens of them, showing mechanical drawings and electrical schematics. In the center of the room, on the main workbench, sat a device covered with a canvas tarp. Dean approached slowly, his heart doing something strange in his chest. He grasped the tarp and pulled it away. The device was beautiful in a way he hadn't expected. Copper coils, wound with perfect precision. Metal components fitted together with the patience of someone who measured success in millimeters. It was incomplete, he could see that. Wires hung loose. Certain sections were obviously missing parts, but the craftsmanship was stunning. The work of someone who cared deeply about every detail. Dean found more blueprints rolled and stored in metal tubes. He spread one across an empty section of workbench and studied it. Keswick Energy Converter, Prototype A, was written across the top in that same precise handwriting. Below it, dense technical drawings showed how the components fit together, how energy flowed through the system, what outputs could be expected. He didn't understand all of it, most of it, honestly, but he understood enough. Virgil had been building something important, something that generated power, that could work independently, that represented years of thought and effort and belief. Dean looked at the device, at the blueprints, at the workshop filled with the tools and dreams of a man who died thinking himself a failure. The town had laughed at Virgil, just like they'd laughed at Dean. They'd dismissed him, overlooked him, never bothered to see what he was actually doing out here. Standing in that workshop, with dust motes dancing in the light, Dean made a promise to a dead man he'd never met. He would understand this work. He would learn what Virgil had been trying to do, and if it was possible, if it was even remotely possible, he would finish it. Dean spent the next 3 weeks living between two worlds. Mornings belonged to the house repairs that couldn't wait, basic maintenance that made the place livable. He fixed the leaking faucet in the kitchen, replaced broken window panes, patched holes in the walls where weather had found its way inside. The work was familiar, the kind of practical problem-solving he'd done his whole life. Afternoons and evenings belonged to the workshop. He started by cleaning, removing years of accumulated dust and debris, organizing the tools, creating inventory lists of what was there. Virgil had been methodical. Every drawer was labeled, every tool had its place. As Dean restored that order, he felt like he was getting to know the man through his habits. The blueprints became his textbooks. He photographed each one with his phone, printed copies at the library in town, spread them across the kitchen table where he could study them over coffee. The designs were complex, but not incomprehensible. Virgil had included notes in the margins, explanations, calculations, reminders to himself. Dean read them like letters from a patient teacher. His warehouse experience helped more than he'd expected. He understood how things fit together, how weight distributed, how systems needed to be balanced. What he didn't understand, he researched. His laptop became a portal to engineering forums, tutorial videos, articles about energy generation and mechanical design. He learned the language slowly, one term at a time. The device itself was remarkable up close. The copper coils were the heart of it, thousands of precise windings that must have taken months to complete. Dean found Virgil's notes about them, entries in the journal describing failed attempts, breakthrough moments, the satisfaction of finally achieving the exact specifications needed. The coils alone represented years of work. Other components were easier to understand. A housing that protected the internal mechanisms, a control panel with gauges and switches, connection points for power output. The whole thing was designed to be functional, not decorative. Every piece served a purpose, nothing wasted. What was missing became clear as Dean studied both the device and the blueprints. Certain electrical components weren't installed. Specific sections showed gaps where parts should be. On one blueprint, Virgil had circled items in red ink and written "need" beside them, with increasing urgency in later notations. Dean made his own list: specialized capacitors, specific gauge wiring, a voltage regulator with particular specifications. Some items he recognized from his warehouse days. Others were foreign, technical components he'd have to research to even understand their function. The financial reality couldn't be ignored. His unemployment benefits covered basic expenses, food, utilities for the farmhouse, gas for his car. There was nothing left over for parts that cost hundreds of dollars. Dean lay awake nights doing mathematics that never balanced, trying to figure out how to fund a project he couldn't justify to anyone, including himself. On a Thursday morning, he swallowed his pride and drove to Kellerman's Hardware in town. The store occupied a building that had probably started life as something else. The high ceilings and exposed brick suggested old money and different times. Now it smelled like sawdust and motor oil, familiar scents that eased something in Dean's chest. Fritz Kellerman stood behind the counter, a man in his 60s with grey hair and reading glasses on a chain around his neck. He looked up as Dean entered, recognition crossing his face. "Dean Halpern, heard you won the Keswick place." "That's right. How's that working out for you?" Dean chose his words carefully. "It's a project. Keeping me busy." Fritz nodded slowly, the kind of nod that said he'd heard the real answer underneath. "What brings you in?" "Actually, I was wondering if you might need help. Part-time, whatever you've got. I've got experience with inventory, shipping, general labor." Fritz studied him for a long moment. Dean kept his expression neutral, refused to let desperation show even though they both knew it was there. "You know which end of a hammer to hold?" "I do. Can you start Monday? 3 days a week, 6 hours a day. Pay's not great, but there's an employee discount." Relief washed through Dean like cool water. "That works." "Thank you. Don't thank me yet. It's real work stocking shelves, helping customers, unloading trucks when they come. You'll earn every dollar." "I'm not afraid of real work." Fritz smiled then, the first genuine warmth Dean had seen from anyone in town since he'd won the farm. "No, I don't imagine you are." Monday morning, 8 o'clock. Dean left the hardware store feeling something he hadn't felt in months: useful. The job wouldn't solve all his problems, but it would help, the employee discount especially. He could buy the parts he needed gradually, piece by piece, building toward completion, the same way Virgil had built the device itself, with patience and persistence. That weekend, he had an unexpected visitor. Dean was working in the front yard, clearing brush from around the porch, when a car pulled up the driveway. An older woman emerged, moving carefully, using a cane for balance. She wore a cardigan despite the warm afternoon and had white hair pulled back in a neat bun. "Hello there," she called. "You must be Dean." Dean set down his rake and walked over. "That's right. I'm Phyllis Drexel. I live about 2 miles down the road. Thought I'd come, introduce myself, see how you're settling in." "That's kind of you. Would you like to come inside?" "I can. Make coffee." "I'd like that very much." Inside, Dean poured coffee while Phyllis looked around the kitchen with eyes that clearly remembered it differently. She ran her hand along the counter, a gesture that was almost affectionate. "I knew Virgil," she said quietly. "Not well, but we were neighbors for 30 years. My husband used to help him sometimes with metal work. Virgil would come over with drawings, ask questions about how to shape certain pieces, what tools to use." Dean set a cup in front of her, sat down across the table. "What was he like?" "Brilliant, kind, terribly lonely, I think, though he never complained." Phyllis sipped her coffee. "People in town thought he was strange. Maybe he was. But strange isn't the same as bad. He was just focused on something the rest of us couldn't see." "His work," Dean said. "Yes. He talked about it sometimes, making something that could help people, something that would prove he'd done something worthwhile with his life." She looked at Dean with eyes that saw more than he'd intended to show. "You found his workshop, didn't you?" Dean nodded slowly. "Are you going to finish what he started?" The question hung in the air between them. Dean thought about lying, deflecting, but something in Phyllis's expression said she deserved honesty. "I'm trying to understand it. Whether I can finish it, I don't know yet." Phyllis smiled. "Virgil would be glad someone's trying. He died thinking it was all for nothing, that he'd wasted his life on something nobody would ever see or care about." She reached across the table and patted Dean's hand. "You prove him wrong, and you'll be giving an old man the peace he never got to feel while he was alive." Before she left, Phyllis wrote her phone number on a scrap of paper. "My husband's old workshop is in our barn. Tools, equipment, some specialized things he collected over the years. You need anything, you come ask. Virgil helped us more times than I can count. Least I can do is help. Someone helping him." After she left, Dean sat on the porch and watched the sun drop toward the horizon. The farm stretched out before him, 40 acres of possibility or foolishness, depending on who you asked. The barn held secrets he was only beginning to understand. The journal beside him contained the thoughts of a man who died too soon, alone, believing himself a failure. Dean thought about his daughter, about the widening distance between them, about his empty apartment and the warehouse job that had defined him for a quarter century, about all the ways life had slowly eroded his sense of purpose, until winning a worthless farm at a county fair felt like the best thing that had happened to him in years. Maybe it was foolish. Maybe he was wasting time on a dead man's impossible dream. But for the first time since his wife died, since Bryn stopped calling, Since the warehouse closed its doors, Dean felt like he was moving toward something instead of just away from everything else. In the workshop, Virgil's device waited in the gathering darkness. Tomorrow Dean would return to it, would try to understand one more circuit, solve one more problem, take one more step toward completing work that had consumed a stranger's life. It wasn't much, but it was enough. It was something to believe in. The hardware store became Dean's anchor to the practical world. Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays from 8 to 2, he stocked shelves, helped customers find what they needed, unloaded delivery trucks. The work was simple, almost meditative. Fritz turned out to be a fair boss, patient with customers and generous with knowledge. When business was slow, he'd show Dean different tools, explain their uses, share tricks learned over 40 years in the trade. The other employees warmed to Dean gradually. There was Marcus, a younger man who handled the lumber yard, and Patricia, who managed the front counter and seemed to know every customer by name. They included Dean in their coffee breaks, their small talk about weather and local gossip. He didn't contribute much, but he listened, and that seemed to be enough. Customers were a different matter. Some ignored him completely. Others offered tight smiles that didn't reach their eyes. A few asked about the farm with barely concealed curiosity. What was he doing out there? Was he planning to sell? Had he found anything interesting? Dean's answers were vague and polite. The workshop remained his secret, Virgil's legacy, something he wasn't ready to expose to judgment or ridicule. His paychecks were modest, but the employee discount made them stretch further. Each week he bought a few components from his list. A voltage regulator one week, specialized wiring the next. Gradually, the gaps in Virgil's device began to fill. The work was painstaking, each connection verified against the blueprints, each component tested before permanent installation. The journal became his companion. Dean read it in the evenings, sitting in the kitchen with coffee, learning not just about the device, but about the man who'd built it. Virgil wrote about his childhood, about being the kid who took things apart to see how they worked, who fixed neighbors' broken radios and lawnmowers, who dreamed of inventing something that mattered. He'd never married. The journal mentioned a woman once, briefly. Sarah said, "I care more about machines than people." Maybe she's right. Maybe that's why I'm better with machines. There was loneliness in those entries, carefully controlled but impossible to miss. Virgil had traded human connection for his work, and the journal suggested he'd wondered if that was the right choice. Dean understood that isolation better than he wanted to admit. His phone calls with Bryn had dwindled to brief text messages. She'd ask how he was doing, he'd say fine. She'd mention being busy with work. The conversations felt like obligations neither of them enjoyed, but both felt compelled to maintain. 6 weeks after moving to the farm, Dean found something that changed everything. He'd been organizing a cabinet in the workshop, moving old tools and supplies, when he noticed the back panel didn't sit flush against the wall. When he pulled it forward, a metal lockbox tumbled out, hitting the floor with a heavy thud. The box was secured with a combination lock. Dean tried obvious numbers, Virgil's birth year, the year he'd bought the farm. Simple sequences. Nothing worked. He was about to set it aside when he remembered something from the journal. Virgil had mentioned his mother's birthday once, noting how she'd always believed in him, even when no one else did. Dean found the entry, calculated the date as a 6-digit number, and tried it. The lock opened. Inside were papers, letters, mostly organized in chronological order with rubber bands. Dean carried the box to the workbench and began reading. The first letter was dated 2003, addressed to Dr. Constance Waverley at the State University Engineering Department. Virgil's letter introduced himself and his work. He described the energy converter, explained the principles behind it, asked if Dr. Waverley might review his calculations. The tone was humble but confident, a man who knew his ideas were sound but wanted expert validation. Dr. Waverley's response came 2 weeks later. She was intrigued, asked for more details, offered encouragement. Thus began a correspondence that spanned several years. The letters showed a collaboration. Developing, Waverley provided feedback on Virgil's designs, suggested refinements, helped him understand complex engineering principles he'd taught himself imperfectly. Dean read through the exchanges, watching the device evolve on paper, seeing how Virgil's raw innovation combined with Waverley's formal training to create something better than either could have achieved alone. There was excitement in the letters, the shared thrill of pursuing something genuinely new. Then the tone shifted. A letter from Virgil dated 2007 mentioned preparing a patent application. He'd documented everything, had the working prototype nearly complete, felt ready to formalize his invention. Dr. Waverley's response was encouraging. She offered to review the application, to provide supporting documentation from their correspondence. The next letter in the stack wasn't from Waverley. It was from the State University Office of Legal Affairs. Dean read it twice, his stomach tightening with each pass. The letter informed Virgil that his proposed patent covered technology substantially similar to research being conducted at the university. It suggested his application might constitute infringement on intellectual property developed through university-funded programs. It strongly advised him to consult with legal counsel before proceeding. There were 3 patent rejection letters after that, each citing different technical reasons, but all concluding the same way: application denied. The language was dense, bureaucratic, but the message was clear. Virgil's invention was too similar to existing research. He couldn't prove independent development. His claims lacked sufficient differentiation. The final letter in the stack was from Dr. Waverley. It was brief, apologetic, devastating. She'd been instructed by her department head to cease all communication with outside inventors. Her research was university property. She couldn't provide documentation supporting Virgil's patent claim. She wished him well but couldn't help him further. On the bottom of that letter, in Virgil's handwriting, were 3 words: "They stole it." Dean sat back from the workbench, his mind racing. He pulled out his laptop and searched for the State University Engineering Department. Their website featured prominent sections on energy research, sustainable power generation, breakthrough innovations in renewable technology. The descriptions sounded remarkably familiar: concepts Virgil had written about in his journal, systems described in the letters to Dr. Waverley. He found Dr. Waverley's faculty page. She was now a full professor, her biography listing numerous publications in energy systems design. Her research had received substantial grant funding. She'd won awards for innovation in sustainable technology. Dean searched for patents held by the university. He found 3 related to energy generation systems, all filed between 2008 and 2010. The technical descriptions were complex, but the core concepts matched what he'd learned from Virgil's blueprints. The devices described in the patents weren't identical to Virgil's design, but they were clearly derived from the same foundational ideas. The patents listed multiple inventors. Dr. Waverley was among them. So was someone named Dr. Bernard Ashton, identified as the department head. Dean returned to the letters, read them again with new understanding. Virgil had shared everything with Dr. Waverley: his calculations, his designs, his breakthrough insights. She'd helped him refine them, had access to every detail. Then, when Virgil tried to formalize his claim, the university had shut him down and filed their own patents using knowledge they'd gained from him. It was theft, dressed in legal language and institutional authority. Virgil had been too isolated, too trusting, too naive about how the world worked. He'd believed in collaboration, in the shared pursuit of knowledge. They'd used that belief against him. Dean thought about Virgil's final journal entries, the exhaustion and defeat in those words. The man had died thinking he'd failed, that his life's work had been for nothing. He'd never known that his ideas had succeeded, just not in his name, not with his recognition, not in any way that gave him credit for what he'd created. The injustice of it burned in Dean's chest. He looked at the device on the workbench, at the blueprints on the walls, at the journal filled with a dead man's dreams. Virgil Keswick had been brilliant. He'd invented something genuinely important, and he'd been robbed by people who had the power to take what he'd created and make it their own. Dean stood and walked to the barn doors, looked out at the farm in the fading light. He'd come here with nothing, no job, no purpose, no hope. He'd found Virgil's work and thought maybe he could finish it, could complete what another man had started. Now he understood the real challenge wasn't technical. The device could be finished. The harder question was what to do with it once it was done. If he revealed the working prototype, would the university claim it? Would they say it infringed on their patents, demand he cease and desist, bury it in legal proceedings? Would anyone believe that a self-taught mechanic had invented it first, that the university's celebrated research was built on stolen foundations? Dean didn't know, but standing there in the workshop, surrounded by evidence of both genius and betrayal, he made a decision. He would finish the device, he would document everything, and then he would find a way to tell Virgil's story, to give the man the recognition that had been stolen from him. It wouldn't be easy, it might not even be possible, but Virgil deserved someone to fight for him, even if that fight came 5 years too late. Dean spent the next week in a state of controlled anger. He went to work at the hardware store, smiled at customers, stocked shelves, maintained the facade of normalcy. But his mind was elsewhere, churning through possibilities, calculating risks, trying to figure out how to expose what had been done to Virgil without destroying any chance of justice. The device was nearly complete. He'd installed the final electrical components, connected the systems according to Virgil's blueprints, double-checked every connection. All that remained was testing, seeing if 30 years of work and belief would actually produce the results Virgil had promised. On a Saturday morning, with clouds gathering overhead and rain threatening, Dean prepared for the first real test. He'd reviewed the startup procedures a dozen times, understood the sequence of steps, knew what measurements to watch. The workshop felt charged with anticipation, as if Virgil himself was watching from somewhere beyond. Dean flipped the main power switch. The device hummed to life, a sound that started low and built gradually. The copper coils began to spin, barely visible movement at first, then faster. Gauges on the control panel flickered and steadied. Numbers appeared on the digital display: voltage, amperage, frequency, all climbing toward the ranges Virgil had predicted. The system stabilized. Dean checked the output meter. The device was generating power, clean, consistent power from minimal input. The conversion ratio exceeded anything he'd seen in commercial systems. It worked. After all the doubt, all the setbacks, all the years Virgil had spent alone in this workshop, it actually worked. Dean stood there, watching the gauges hold steady, and felt something crack open in his chest. Joy mixed with grief, triumph shadowed by loss. Virgil should have been here for this moment. He should have seen his life's work validated, should have felt this vindication. Instead, he died believing he'd failed, never knowing how close he'd come, never getting the recognition he'd deserved. Dean ran the device for an hour, monitoring every system, taking measurements, documenting everything with photos and videos. The performance remained consistent, the output steady. There were no fluctuations, no signs of stress. The engineering was sound. The design was brilliant. Virgil Keswick had built something revolutionary, and the world had never known. After shutting down the system, Dean sat at the workbench with his laptop and began researching in earnest. He needed to understand patent law, intellectual property rights, what recourse might exist for theft that occurred years ago. The reading was dense and discouraging. Proving that the university had stolen Virgil's ideas would require documentation, expert testimony, resources Dean didn't have. But he had the letters. He had the journals. He had the device itself, built years before the university filed their patents. That had to count for something. Dean thought about Dr. Constance Waverley, tried to imagine the woman behind the faculty photo on the university website. Had she known what was happening? Had she willingly participated in stealing Virgil's work, or had she been pressured by her department head? The letters suggested she'd cared about the research, had genuinely collaborated with Virgil, but she'd also abandoned him when the university demanded it. On impulse, Dean drafted an email. He kept it simple, professional, non-accusatory. He explained that he'd acquired Virgil Keswick's farm, found correspondence between Virgil and Dr. Waverley, discovered the workshop and the device. He said he'd completed the prototype and it worked exactly as Virgil had described. He asked if she'd be willing to discuss Virgil's contributions to energy research. He read the email 3 times before sending it, knowing it might accomplish nothing, might even be dangerous. But doing nothing felt like abandoning Virgil all over again. The response came faster than Dean expected, within 4 hours. Dr. Waverley's message was brief, but emotional. She asked if they could speak by phone, provided her cell number, said she'd been carrying guilt about Virgil for years. They talked that evening. Dean sat on the farmhouse porch with his phone, watching darkness settle over the fields, while Dr. Waverley spoke from her office 300 miles away. "I think about him often," she said, her voice carrying weight accumulated over years. "The correspondence we had, those were some of the most intellectually exciting exchanges of my career. Virgil was self-taught, but he had an intuitive grasp of systems that most trained engineers never develop." "What happened?" Dean asked. A long pause. "Bernard Ashton happened. He was my department head. Ambitious, always looking for the next big grant, the next publication that would elevate the program's reputation. I mentioned Virgil's work in a faculty meeting, described some of his innovations. Bernard was immediately interested. He asked to see the correspondence, the designs. I thought he wanted to help, maybe bring Virgil in as a consultant. But that's not what he wanted." No. The word was heavy with regret. He saw commercial potential, started talking about patents, about how the university could develop the technology, secure funding, build research programs around it. I tried to explain that these were Virgil's ideas, that we couldn't just appropriate them. Bernard said Virgil had no formal credentials, no institutional backing, no way to prove independent development. He said, if we didn't move forward, someone else would, and at least we'd use the technology responsibly. "So you helped him steal it?" "I did." Her voice broke slightly. "I told myself I was being practical. That this was how academia worked. That Virgil would never be able to navigate the patent process anyway. I rationalized every compromise until I didn't recognize myself anymore. When Virgil reached out after the patent rejections, I was told not to respond. I should have fought harder. I should have done something." Dean listened to her breathe on the other end of the line, gathering herself. "Bernard built his late career on that research," she continued. 3 patents, millions in grant funding, a named professorship. He retired 2 years ago, wealthy and celebrated. Meanwhile, Virgil Keswick died alone on a farm, his work uncredited, his genius unrecognized. "I've completed the device," Dean said. "It works exactly as he designed it." Silence stretched between them. When Dr. Waverley spoke again, her voice was stronger. "I'll help you. However I can. I have documentation, emails, internal memos, meeting notes. I kept everything. Maybe because some part of me knew this day would come. If you're planning to expose what happened, I'll testify. I'll provide evidence. It won't undo what I did, but it's something." They talked for another hour, developing a strategy. Dr. Waverley would compile her documentation quietly, send it to Dean through secure channels. She'd reach out to colleagues who might support Virgil's claim, people who valued truth over institutional loyalty. She warned that the university would fight back hard. Their reputation was at stake, along with the funding and prestige built on Bernard's research. "Are you prepared for that?" she asked. "They have lawyers, resources, the ability to make your life very difficult." Dean looked out at the dark fields, at the barn where Virgil's workshop waited, at the farm that had seemed like a cruel joke 6 months ago, but had become something else entirely. "I've got nothing to lose," he said, "and Virgil deserves this. He deserves someone to fight for him." After they hung up, Dean sat in the darkness for a long time. The scope of what he was undertaking had expanded dramatically. This wasn't just about finishing a dead man's project anymore. It was about confronting institutional power, about challenging people who had every advantage, about demanding justice for someone who couldn't fight for himself. It was terrifying. It was probably foolish. But as Dean sat there on Virgil Keswick's porch, on land that now belonged to him through nothing but chance, he felt more certain of his purpose than he had in years. Tomorrow, he'd call Phyllis's nephew, the attorney she'd mentioned. He'd start documenting everything systematically, building a case that could withstand scrutiny. He'd reach out to journalists, to advocacy groups, to anyone who might care that a brilliant man had been erased from his own story. The rain started then, gentle at first, then building to a steady drumming on the roof. Dean stayed on the porch, letting the sound wash over him, feeling cleansed by its persistence. Virgil had built something that mattered. Now Dean would make sure the world knew who'd built it. Lawrence Ketchum turned out to be exactly what Dean needed, a lawyer who'd spent 40 years in corporate law and had no patience left for institutional dishonesty. He was 72, semi-retired, and when Dean explained the situation over coffee at Phyllis's kitchen table, his eyes lit up with the kind of righteous indignation that comes from decades of watching powerful people get away with things. "They did this to a man who had no resources to fight back," Lawrence said, reviewing the letters Dean had brought. "Classic institutional theft. They knew he couldn't afford legal representation, knew he'd be dismissed as a crank if he made accusations. So they took what they wanted and buried him in bureaucratic language." "Can we prove it?" Dean asked. "With what you've got here, plus Dr. Waverley's testimony, yes, I think we can. Patent law has provisions for challenging grants based on prior art and fraud. The fact that Virgil's correspondence predates their filings by years is significant. The fact that Dr. Waverley will testify they used his designs, that's potentially explosive." Lawrence explained the process. "They'd need to file formal challenges to the university's patents, provide evidence of Virgil's prior invention, demonstrate that the university had knowledge of his work before filing their own claims. It would take months, maybe years. The university would fight with everything they had. But here's the thing," Lawrence said, leaning forward. "Universities hate bad publicity more than they hate legal losses. If we can get media attention, show the human side of this story, a self-taught genius robbed of his life's work by the institution that should have championed him, they'll feel pressure to settle. Especially if we can demonstrate that their celebrated research program was built on stolen foundations. What do you need from me? Everything. Every document, every blueprint, every journal entry. We build a timeline showing exactly when Virgil developed each component, when he shared information with Dr. Waverley, when the university filed their patents. We make it so clear, so undeniable, that their only option is to acknowledge what they did." Dean spent the next 2 weeks assembling a comprehensive evidence package. He photographed every page of Virgil's journals, organized the letters chronologically, documented the device's construction with detailed images and technical specifications. Dr. Waverley sent encrypted files, meeting notes from 2007 that mentioned promising external research, emails, where Bernard Ashton specifically asked about the Keswick designs, internal memos discussing patent strategy. The case was building, but Lawrence emphasized they needed something more, something that would capture public attention, make people care about a man they'd never heard of. "We need to show them it works," Dean said. "The device. We need to demonstrate that Virgil's invention wasn't just theoretical. It's real, it's functional, and it could actually make a difference." Lawrence nodded slowly. "A public demonstration. Show the community, bring in media, let people see what Virgil created. That makes it personal, makes it real. Then we release the story about what happened to him." They set a date 3 weeks out, enough time to spread the word, prepare the workshop, ensure everything was perfect. Dean contacted Henrietta Bosch, a journalist at the county newspaper who'd covered the raffle that had changed his life. She was immediately interested, saw the human interest angle, promised to bring a photographer and write a feature story. Word spread through town with the speed that only small-town networks achieve. Fritz mentioned it to customers at the hardware store. Phyllis told her church group. Within days, people Dean barely knew were stopping him to ask about the demonstration, about what Virgil had built, about this device that supposedly could change how rural communities accessed power. The attention made Dean uncomfortable. He wasn't doing this for recognition, he was doing it for Virgil. But Lawrence explained that public support would be crucial. The more people who care about this story, the harder it is for the university to dismiss or bury it, he said. Dean called Bryn to tell her about the demonstration. She answered on the third ring, sounding distracted as always. "Dad, hi. What's going on? I wanted you to know I'm doing a public demonstration of Virgil's device. 3 weeks from Saturday. Media will be there, probably a fair crowd from town." Silence on the other end. "Then you're really doing this? You're actually going through with it?" "I am." "Dad, this could backfire. What if people laugh? What if the device doesn't work the way you think it does? What if you just make yourself look foolish?" Dean felt the old frustration rising but pushed it down. "It works, Bryn. I've tested it dozens of times, and even if people laugh, Virgil lived with their laughter for 30 years. If I can give him one day where people see him clearly, where they understand what he accomplished, it's worth it." "You really care about this?" "I do." "Why? You never knew him. This isn't your fight." Dean thought about how to answer that. About loneliness and purpose, about feeling invisible and finding meaning, about how honoring Virgil's work had somehow restored his own sense of worth. "Maybe it wasn't my fight at the beginning," he said finally, "but it is now, and I could use your support." He heard her breathe, heard something shift in the silence. "When did you say the demonstration was?" 3 weeks from Saturday, 2 o'clock. I'll try to be there." "You will?" "You're my father. And this clearly matters to you. So yes, I'll try." After they hung up, Dean sat with the phone in his hand, feeling something cautiously close to hope. The rift between them hadn't magically healed, but maybe it had narrowed slightly. Maybe that was enough for now. The final 2 weeks were a blur of preparation. Dean cleaned the workshop until it gleamed, organized displays showing the device's components, printed enlarged versions of key blueprints to mount on the walls. He tested the system repeatedly, verified every measurement, ensured there would be no failures during the demonstration. Fritz gave him the day off work without being asked. "This is important," he said simply. "Go make your case." Phyllis helped spread the word through her networks. The church bulletin mentioned it. The community center posted notices. Local TV news picked up the story, a human interest piece about a reclusive inventor and the man trying to honor his legacy. The university got wind of it. Lawrence received a call from their legal department, asking what Dean was planning, warning that any claims of patent infringement would be met with legal action. Lawrence's response was measured but firm. "Mr. Halpern plans to demonstrate a device built by Virgil Keswick, using Virgil Keswick's designs on Virgil Keswick's property. If that concerns the university, perhaps they should examine why." Dr. Waverley called Dean 3 days before the demonstration. "I'm coming," she said. "I'll testify publicly if you want me to. It's time to tell the truth." The night before the demonstration, Dean walked through the workshop one last time. Everything was ready. The device sat on its display stand, copper coils polished, connections secure, ready to prove what Virgil had known all along. The walls were lined with evidence of 30 years of dedication, blueprints, journals, photographs, the accumulated proof of genius. Dismissed and betrayed, Dean thought about the man who'd built all this, who'd worked in solitude and died believing himself a failure. Tomorrow, that narrative would change. Tomorrow, the world would see Virgil Keswick clearly, would understand what had been lost when they'd laughed instead of listened. Dean turned off the workshop lights and locked the door. Tomorrow would vindicate Virgil's life's work. Tomorrow would tell the truth that should have been told years ago. Tomorrow, justice, however imperfect, however late, would finally arrive. He just hoped it would be enough. Saturday morning arrived with unseasonably warm October weather, the kind of day that felt like a gift. Dean woke before dawn, too nervous to sleep, and spent the early hours making final preparations. He set up folding chairs borrowed from the community center, arranged them in rows facing the workshop entrance. He positioned the device where everyone could see it clearly, made sure the power meters were visible, double-checked every connection one last time. By noon, cars started arriving. Fritz came first, helping Dean set up a canopy in case the weather turned. Phyllis arrived with her church group, a dozen older folks who remembered Virgil from town, who'd never known what he was working on out here. Marcus and Patricia from the hardware store showed up, curious and supportive. Neighbors Dean barely knew pulled up the driveway, drawn by curiosity and the novelty of something actually happening in Millerton. The local TV crew arrived at 1:30. A young reporter named Kevin Marsh and a cameraman who looked barely out of college. Henrietta Bosch was already there, notebook in hand, asking Dean questions about Virgil's life, taking notes about everything. By 2 o'clock, more than 150 people had gathered. Folding chairs were all filled, people standing in the back, others sitting on the grass. Dean had expected maybe 30. The turnout overwhelmed him, made him understand for the first time how many people were paying attention, how much this moment mattered. Bryn arrived at 2:10, parking at the end of the long line of cars. Dean saw her walking up the driveway, professional in her work clothes, looking uncertain and out of place among the farmers and townspeople. When their eyes met, she smiled, tentative but genuine. Dean felt something release in his chest. At 2:15, a rental car pulled up and Dr. Constance Waverley emerged. She was in her 60s, grey-haired, dressed simply, her face showing the strain of carrying guilt for years. Dean walked over to greet her. She took his hand in both of hers. "Thank you for doing this," she said quietly. "For him. For the truth." Lawrence Ketchum stood and called for attention. The crowd quieted, all eyes turning toward the workshop entrance, where Dean stood with the device visible behind him. "Thank you all for coming," Dean began, his voice steadier than he felt. 6 months ago, I won this farm in a raffle. People laughed, and honestly, I couldn't blame them. The place was a wreck. I had no idea what I was doing here." He paused, looked out at the faces watching him. "But then I found something. I found the life's work of a man named Virgil Keswick." He told the story, simply, without embellishment. How he'd discovered the journal, the workshop, the device Virgil had spent 30 years building. How he'd learned about Virgil's dream of creating affordable power for rural communities, of proving that someone without credentials or institutional backing could still contribute something meaningful to the world. "Virgil died 5 years ago," Dean said. "He died believing he'd failed, that his work had been for nothing. But I'm here to show you that he didn't fail. He succeeded. He built something remarkable." Dean stepped aside, revealing the device in full. The crowd leaned forward, studying the copper coils, the intricate components, the careful craftsmanship, visible in every detail. "This is Virgil's energy converter," It generates clean power with efficiency that exceeds anything commercially available. Let me show you how it works. Dean explained the principles in simple terms, how the system captured and converted energy, how the components worked together, what outputs could be expected. He showed them Virgil's blueprints mounted on the walls, let them see the precision of his designs, the depth of his understanding. Then he powered it on. The device hummed to life, that distinctive sound Dean had come to know so well. The copper coils began their measured rotation. Gauges flickered and steadied. The crowd watched in silence as numbers appeared on the display, voltage climbing, amperage stabilizing, frequency holding steady. Dean had connected the output to a power strip with multiple appliances, lights, a space heater, a small refrigerator, a power tool. He flipped switches, and each device activated. The lights glowed bright. The heater began warming. The refrigerator's compressor kicked on. The power tool whirred to life. The power meter showed the device generating more energy than it consumed, operating with an efficiency that made several people gasp audibly. It wasn't magic, it was engineering, brilliant and patient and real. The crowd broke into spontaneous applause. Dean let the system run. Let them see it maintain steady output, prove its reliability. People stood for a better view, whispered to each other, pointed at the gauges and displays. After 10 minutes, Dean shut the system down and turned to face the crowd. Virgil Keswick built this. A self-taught mechanic from this town. A man you might have known, might have passed on the street, might have dismissed as odd or isolated. He created something that could genuinely help rural communities access affordable power. He should have been celebrated. Instead, he was robbed. The mood shifted, the celebration fading into something more serious. Dean nodded to Lawrence, who stood with a folder of documents. "What Mr. Halpern hasn't told you yet," Lawrence said, "is that Virgil's work was stolen by the State University. He shared his designs with faculty there, sought their expertise, trusted them to help him protect his invention. Instead, they took his ideas and filed their own patents. They built research programs and secured millions in funding based on technology Virgil created, and they let him die believing he'd failed." The crowd stirred, angry murmurs spreading. Lawrence outlined the evidence, the dated correspondence, the timeline showing Virgil's work predating the university's patents, the internal documents proving they'd had access to his designs. Then Dr. Waverley stood. Dean hadn't asked her to speak, but she walked to the front and faced the crowd with the demeanor of someone confessing. "My name is Dr. Constance Waverley. I was Virgil's collaborator, and I betrayed him." Her voice carried clearly in the sudden silence. "I corresponded with Virgil for years. He shared everything with me, his calculations, his designs, his dreams. When my department heads saw commercial potential in his work, I was pressured to provide access to everything. I told myself I was being practical, that this was how academia worked. But the truth is simpler and uglier. I helped steal from a man who trusted me." She described what had happened, confirmed Lawrence's account, admitted her complicity. "I've carried guilt about this for years. Nothing I do now can give Virgil back what was taken from him. But I can tell the truth. I can say publicly that the State University's celebrated energy research was built on stolen foundations, that Virgil Keswick was the true innovator, and we erased him from his own story." The crowd was silent now, absorbing the weight of what they were hearing. Kevin Marsh's cameraman filmed everything. Henrietta's pen flew across her notebook. An unexpected voice spoke from the back. Phyllis, standing with her cane, her voice wavering but clear. "I knew Virgil for 30 years. He was kind. He helped my husband with metalwork projects, never asked for anything in return. We never knew what he was building out here, but we knew he was a good man. This town treated him like he was strange, like he didn't matter. Turns out, he mattered more than any of us knew." Others stood then, sharing small memories. The mechanic who remembered Virgil fixing a complicated engine problem no one else could solve. The librarian who recalled him reading engineering textbooks for hours, always polite, always curious. People who'd seen Virgil around town for decades but never really seen him at all. The pattern emerged clearly: a brilliant, kind man, rendered invisible by a community that didn't understand him, then actively harmed by institutions that should have protected his work. Dean watched it all, felt the narrative shift happening in real time. This wasn't just about a device anymore. It was about dignity, about recognition, about saying clearly that Virgil Keswick mattered, that his life had meaning, that the truth deserved to be told, regardless of who it embarrassed or what institutions it challenged. When the demonstration officially ended, people didn't leave. They clustered in small groups, discussing what they'd seen, what they'd learned. Many approached Dean to thank him, to say they wished they'd known Virgil better, to express support for whatever came next. Bryn found him as the crowd thinned. She looked at him with eyes that held something new, not pity or worry, but respect. "Dad, you did something important today. You gave that man his dignity back. You proved that his work mattered." Dean pulled her into a hug, felt her arms tighten around him. When they separated, both had tears in their eyes. "I'm proud of you," she said simply. Those 4 words, more than anything else that had happened that day, made Dean feel like he'd finally done something right. The demonstration's aftermath moved faster than Dean anticipated. By Sunday morning, the local news segment had been shared thousands of times online. By Monday, his phone wouldn't stop ringing journalists from regional papers, bloggers covering technology and innovation, even a producer from a national morning show asking if he'd be willing to appear via satellite. Dean declined most interviews, redirected them to Lawrence, or suggested they contact Dr. Waverley. This wasn't about him becoming famous, it was about Virgil getting recognition. But the attention was building, creating momentum that felt both exhilarating and terrifying. The State University issued its first statement on Tuesday, a brief, carefully worded response claiming they were reviewing historical records regarding Mr. Keswick's correspondence and had no current knowledge of any impropriety in our patent processes. The statement was exactly what Lawrence had predicted: defensive, non-committal, designed to buy time while they assessed the damage. "They're scared," Lawrence said when he called to read Dean the statement. "That's good. Scared institutions make mistakes, and we need them to make one more: the mistake of fighting us publicly instead of settling quietly." The media pressure intensified. Henrietta's article got picked up by the Associated Press, spreading Virgil's story to newspapers across the country. Technology blogs published detailed analyses of the patents, comparing them to Virgil's designs from the letters. The timeline was damning. Virgil's documented work predated the university's patents by years, and the similarities were too precise to be coincidental. Dr. Waverley became an unexpected ally in the media campaign. She gave interviews explaining her role in what had happened, accepting responsibility, while also making clear the institutional pressures she'd faced. Her willingness to confess publicly gave the story credibility. This wasn't just an outsider making accusations, it was an insider confirming them. On Thursday, Dean received an unexpected call from a woman named Iris Chen, who identified herself as a staff attorney for the National Innovation Protection Alliance, a non-profit that advocated for independent inventors. She'd read about Virgil's case and believed it had national significance. "What happened to Mr. Keswick happens more often than people realize," she explained. "Small inventors, people without resources or institutional backing, get their ideas appropriated by universities or corporations who know they can't fight back. Your case is unusual because you have documentation, you have the working device, and you have a cooperating witness. We'd like to help." The organization offered pro bono legal support, connections to sympathetic media outlets, and most importantly, expertise in intellectual property cases involving institutional defendants. Lawrence welcomed the assistance, recognizing that Dean's small-town attorney and a semi-retired corporate lawyer needed reinforcement against the university's legal team. The university's second statement came Friday, more detailed and slightly more conciliatory. They acknowledged that Virgil Keswick had corresponded with faculty members, admitted that some exchange of technical information had occurred, but maintained that their patents were based on independent research conducted by university personnel. They offered to explore appropriate recognition of Virgil's contributions. It wasn't enough. Lawrence, working with Iris Chen, drafted a response demanding full acknowledgement of Virgil as the original inventor, formal apology, establishment of a scholarship in his name, and agreement not to pursue any claims against Dean's working prototype. They gave the university 2 weeks to respond before filing formal patent challenges and pursuing media exposure of internal documents. During this maelstrom of legal maneuvering and media attention, something quieter but more significant happened. Bryn started calling regularly, not the obligatory check-ins Dean had grown accustomed to, but real conversations. She asked about the case's progress, about how he was handling the attention, about what he planned to do with the farm long-term. "I've been thinking," she said during one evening call. "I could take some time off work, come stay for a few weeks, help you manage all this. You shouldn't have to deal with it alone." Dean felt something warm and fragile bloom in his chest. "You don't have to do that. I know you're busy. Dad, I want to. I've been so focused on my career, on proving I could succeed, that I forgot about the things that actually matter. You're fighting for something important. I'd like to be part of it." She arrived the following weekend with 2 suitcases and an open-ended leave from her job. They fell into an easy rhythm, Bryn, handling media inquiries and scheduling, Dean continuing his work at the hardware store and maintaining the farm, both of them spending evenings in the workshop or on the porch, talking more honestly than they had in years. Bryn read Virgil's journals, studied the device, came to understand why this had become so important to her father. One night she said, "He was like you, wasn't he? Overlooked, underestimated, but doing meaningful work anyway." Dean hadn't thought of it that way, but she was right. He and Virgil had both been invisible men, dismissed by people who measured worth in credentials and status rather than character and contribution. Fighting for Virgil was, in some way, fighting for himself too. The town's attitude had shifted completely. People who'd laughed at Dean for winning a worthless farm now stopped him at the grocery store to express support. To say they were proud someone was finally standing up for Virgil, to share their own small memories of the quiet man who'd lived at the edge of town. Fritz put a donation jar on the hardware store counter with a sign, "Support the Keswick Legacy Fund." Customers dropped in bills and coins, small contributions that added up to several $100s. When Dean protested, Fritz said, "Let people help. They feel bad about how Virgil was treated. This is their way of making it right." As the university's deadline approached, Dean prepared for whatever came next. If they settled, that was victory. If they fought, he was ready for that too. He had evidence, allies, public support, and most importantly, the truth. The night before the deadline, Dean sat in the workshop with the device running, its steady hum like a heartbeat. Bryn joined him, and they sat in comfortable silence, watching the gauges hold steady, watching power flow from Virgil's brilliant mind into practical reality. "Whatever happens," Bryn said, "you've already won. You gave him back his dignity. That matters more than patents or settlements or any of it." Dean nodded, but he hoped for more. He hoped for complete vindication, for Virgil's name on every patent that had stolen from him, for a scholarship that would help rural kids like Virgil had been, for a legacy that would outlast them all. Tomorrow, they'd know if hope was enough. The university's legal team called at 9:30 Tuesday morning. Lawrence had Dean and Bryn on speakerphone in his office when the call came through. "We'd like to schedule a meeting to discuss resolution," the lead counsel said, her voice professionally neutral. "Would your clients be available this Thursday?" Lawrence glanced at Dean, who nodded. "We can make that work. Our office or yours? We'd prefer neutral ground. There's a conference facility midway between our locations. We'll send details." After the call ended, Lawrence leaned back in his chair. "They're ready to negotiate. The media pressure worked. They want this settled before it gets worse." "What should we expect?" Bryn asked. "They'll try to minimize their acknowledgement, offer money instead of admission of wrongdoing, push for confidentiality agreements. We hold firm on what matters: public recognition of Virgil as the original inventor, no claims on Dean's prototype, and the scholarship. Everything else is negotiable." Thursday arrived cold and grey, threatening snow. Dean wore his only suit, bought for his wife's funeral 7 years ago. Bryn drove, her professional demeanor settling over her like armor. Lawrence sat in the back, reviewing documents one final time. The conference facility was modern and anonymous, the kind of place where corporations settled disputes away from public scrutiny. The university's team was already there: 3 attorneys, a public relations director, and Dr. Marcus Pritchard, the current department head who'd inherited the energy research program built on Virgil's stolen work. Dr. Waverley arrived separately, having driven 4 hours to be present. Her inclusion had been Dean's condition if they were going to discuss Virgil's contributions. The person who'd worked most closely with him deserved to be there. The meeting started with forced pleasantries, then moved quickly to business. The university's lead counsel, a woman named Victoria Ashford, opened with their position. "The university acknowledges that Mr. Keswick corresponded with our faculty and that some technical exchange occurred. We're prepared to offer compensation to Mr. Halpern for his time and effort in completing Mr. Keswick's work, and we're willing to include appropriate recognition of Mr. Keswick's contributions in future publications." "That's insufficient," Lawrence said calmly. "Your patents are based directly on Mr. Keswick's designs, shared through correspondence with Dr. Waverley. You filed those patents knowing they were derived from his work. Appropriate recognition doesn't address the fundamental issue. Virgil Keswick was the original inventor, and your institution stole his intellectual property." Victoria's expression tightened. "That's a serious accusation." "It's a documented fact." Lawrence slid a folder across the table. "We have dated correspondence showing Mr. Keswick developed these concepts years before your patents were filed. We have internal university emails discussing the Keswick designs. We have Dr. Waverley's testimony confirming she shared his complete technical specifications with department leadership. And we have national media attention on this story. You can fight us in court and lose publicly, or you can settle this fairly and minimize the damage to your reputation." Iris Chen, participating via video conference, added her voice. "The National Innovation Protection Alliance is prepared to file amicus briefs supporting challenges to all 3 of your energy-related patents. We're also prepared to publicize this case as an example of institutional appropriation of independent inventors' work. This will become a landmark case either way. The question is whether the university is the villain or shows leadership in making things right." The room fell silent. Dr. Pritchard shifted uncomfortably. The PR director whispered something to Victoria, who nodded slowly. "What exactly are you asking for?" Victoria asked. Lawrence outlined their demands clearly. First, public acknowledgement that Virgil Keswick was the original inventor of the core technology your patents are based on, not contributor or collaborator inventor. Second, formal written apology from the university for failing to properly credit his work. Third, an endowed scholarship in Mr. Keswick's name, fully funded, for students from rural communities studying engineering. Fourth, agreement not to pursue any claims against Mr. Halpern's working prototype or any improvements he makes to Mr. Keswick's design. Fifth, all future university publications and patents derived from this technology must cite Mr. Keswick's foundational contributions. And in exchange, Victoria asked. Mr. Halpern agrees not to pursue monetary damages, and the university's research programs can continue using the technology. We're not trying to shut down your work. We're trying to ensure Virgil Keswick gets the credit he deserved while he was alive and definitely deserves now that he's gone. The university team requested a private consultation. Dean, Bryn, Lawrence, Dr. Waverley, and Iris's video feed relocated to a smaller conference room. They waited in tense silence, drinking bad coffee from a communal pot, watching snow begin to fall outside the windows. "Do you think they'll agree?" Bryn asked. "They have to," Iris said from the screen. "The alternative is a protracted legal battle they'll probably lose, with guaranteed negative publicity throughout. Settling is their best option." "Doctor," Waverley spoke quietly. "Bernard Ashton built his late career on Virgil's work. If the university acknowledges the theft, it tarnishes everything Bernard accomplished, calls into question the integrity of the entire research program. That's what they're really weighing is protecting Bernard's legacy worth the cost of fighting us?" An hour passed, then another. Dean watched snow accumulate on the parking lot, coating cars in white, erasing the boundaries between things. He thought about Virgil working alone in that workshop for 30 years, believing no one would ever recognize his contributions, dying with that belief intact. Finally, the university team called them back. Victoria's expression was carefully controlled. "We're prepared to accept most of your terms with some modifications to language. We'd like to work through the specific wording together." Relief washed through Dean, but he kept his face neutral. They weren't done yet. The negotiation continued for 3 more hours, every word scrutinized, every phrase debated. But the fundamental agreement held. Virgil would be acknowledged as the original inventor. The scholarship would be established. Dean's prototype was protected. As evening approached and the final language was being drafted, Dean excused himself and stepped outside. Snow fell steadily now, silent and cleansing. He pulled out his phone and looked at the photograph he'd saved, Virgil standing beside his device, that slight smile suggesting secrets and satisfaction. "We did it," Dean whispered to the image. "Your name will be remembered. Your work will be credited. You didn't fail, Virgil. You succeeded." The final settlement documents were signed at 7:30 that evening. Dean's hand trembled slightly as he wrote his name, the weight of what they'd accomplished settling over him like the snow outside. Bryn signed as witness, then Lawrence, then Dr. Waverley. The university representatives added their signatures with expressions that mixed relief and resignation. Victoria Ashford stood and extended her hand to Dean. "Mr. Halpern, the university recognizes that this situation should have been handled differently years ago. We hope this agreement honors Mr. Keswick's memory appropriately." Dean shook her hand, noting the careful phrasing, still not quite an apology, still protecting institutional pride. But the document said what mattered. Virgil's name would be restored. That was enough. The drive home felt surreal. Bryn navigated the snowy roads carefully, while Dean sat in the passenger seat, exhausted and oddly empty. He'd expected to feel triumphant, but instead felt only a quiet satisfaction mixed with lingering sadness that Virgil hadn't lived to see this day. "You okay, Dad?" Bryn asked. "Just tired, and thinking about how Virgil should be here. He is, in a way. Everything you did was for him. He's present in that." They stopped for dinner at a small diner halfway home. Over coffee and sandwiches, neither of them was particularly hungry for. They talked about what came next. The university would issue a public statement within a week. A formal ceremony to dedicate the Virgil Keswick Memorial Laboratory would be scheduled for the following month. The scholarship fund would accept its first applications by spring. "What about you?" Bryn asked. "What do you want to do now?" Dean considered the question. 6 months ago, his life had been empty, except for job searches and loneliness. Now he had the farm, the workshop, Virgil's legacy to steward, and a relationship with his daughter that felt real again. "I want to keep the workshop open," he said. "Make it a place where people can see what Virgil built, understand his story, maybe offer it as a learning space for students interested in independent invention." "That's beautiful, Dad. You could call it the Keswick Innovation Center." "Maybe, but smaller, more personal." Virgil wasn't about big institutions and fancy names. He was about doing the work, solving problems, helping people. They arrived home near midnight. The farmhouse lights were on. Dean had left them burning, powered by Virgil's device. The sight made him smile. Virgil's invention was literally keeping the lights on, doing exactly what he designed it to do. Inside, Dean made tea while Bryn built a fire in the living room fireplace. They sat together in comfortable silence, watching flames dance, feeling the day's tension slowly release. "I'm proud of you," Bryn said. "Not just for winning, for caring enough to fight, for seeing value in someone everyone else dismissed, for refusing to let his story end in obscurity. I'm proud of you too, for taking time off work to be here, for helping me through this, for being willing to step away from your life to support mine." "It's not stepping away," Bryn said quietly. "I think I'm stepping toward something. I've been so focused on career success that I forgot what success actually means. This being here, helping with something that matters, reconnecting with you, this feels more important than any promotion I might have gotten." They talked late into the night, years of distance gradually closing. Bryn admitted she'd been drowning in work that felt meaningless, chasing accomplishments that left her empty. Dean confessed how invisible he'd felt after losing his job, how winning the farm had seemed like cosmic mockery until he found Virgil's work and discovered purpose again. "Maybe we both needed this," Bryn said. "You needed to find meaning. I needed to remember what meaning feels like. Virgil gave us both that gift." The next morning, Dean woke to find Bryn already up, making breakfast. The smell of coffee and bacon filled the kitchen, domestic and comforting. They ate together at the table, where Dean had first read Virgil's journal, where he'd studied blueprints night after night, where the whole journey had really begun. Lawrence called mid-morning with news. "The university's press release is going out this afternoon. I've reviewed the final version. It's everything we agreed to. Virgil's name is prominent, the acknowledgement is clear, and they've announced the scholarship with full details. It's done, Dean. You won." After the call, Dean walked out to the workshop. Inside, the device sat silent on its stand, waiting. He powered it on, watched the familiar sequence of startup, heard the hum that had become like a heartbeat to him. The gauges climbed to their steady operating ranges. Everything worked perfectly, just as Virgil had designed it to. Dean pulled out the journal and opened to a blank page near the end. He'd been adding his own entries, documenting the completion of the device, the discovery of the theft, the fight for recognition. Now he wrote the final entry, February 14th. "Today we won. The university has acknowledged Virgil Keswick as the original inventor. His name will be on a laboratory, on a scholarship, in academic publications. People will know what he accomplished. It took too long, and he didn't live to see it. But the truth is finally told. Virgil, if somehow you can know this, your work mattered. Your life mattered. You weren't forgotten. You never will be." He set down the pen and looked around the workshop, the space where Virgil had spent thousands of hours alone, believing his work would die with him. Now it would live on, properly credited, genuinely honored, making a difference for future generations. Dean heard footsteps and turned to see Bryn in the doorway. "The university's statement just posted online," she said, holding up her phone. "Want to see it?" Dean walked over and read the headline, "State University acknowledges Virgil Keswick as pioneer in sustainable energy research." The statement was clear and comprehensive, exactly as negotiated. Virgil's name appeared 12 times. The scholarship was detailed prominently. The acknowledgement of past failures was diplomatic but present. Dean handed the phone back to Bryn. He'd be amazed, I think, that people actually cared enough to get it right. Because of you, Dad. You made them care. They stood together in the workshop, the device humming its steady song, Virgil's legacy no longer hidden, but finally, rightfully, recognized. 3 months later, spring arrived at the farm with a gentleness that felt like benediction. Dean stood in the workshop doorway, watching green push through brown earth, life returning after winter's dormancy. The farm had awakened in ways both literal and metaphorical, the land renewing itself, while Virgil's story blossomed into something larger than Dean had imagined possible. The university ceremony had taken place in March. Dean, Bryn, Phyllis, Lawrence, and a delegation from Millerton attended the dedication of the Virgil Keswick Memorial Energy Innovation Laboratory. The university president gave a speech acknowledging an unfortunate oversight in properly crediting pioneering work and praising Virgil's innovative spirit and dedication to practical solutions. The agreement language was careful, institutional, but the meaning was clear. A bronze plaque now hung in the laboratory's entrance with Virgil's photograph and an inscription recognizing his contributions. It wasn't everything, but it was something permanent, something that would outlast them all. The scholarship had been awarded to its first recipient, a 19-year-old woman named Maya Blackstone from a farming community 2 counties over. She'd taught herself advanced mathematics working in her family's equipment shed, dreamed of studying renewable energy, but couldn't afford university tuition. Now she'd attend on a full scholarship bearing Virgil's name, the first of many who would benefit from his restored legacy. Dean had met her briefly at the ceremony. She'd gripped his hand with calloused fingers and said, "Thank you for fighting for him. People like us, we need to know that someone who started like we did can accomplish something that matters." Her words had stayed with Dean, echoing Virgil's own hopes expressed in journals written decades ago. The scholarship wasn't just financial assistance, it was validation that rural genius existed, that self-taught brilliance deserved recognition, that the path to contribution didn't require perfect credentials or institutional blessing. The farm itself had become something unexpected. Word spread about Virgil's workshop, and people started visiting engineering students, wanting to see where the innovation happened. Journalists writing follow-up pieces, families from town who'd never thought to visit while Virgil was alive, but came now to pay respects to his memory. Dean gave tours twice monthly, walking visitors through the workshop, showing them the device, telling Virgil's story. He never charged admission. Virgil had wanted his work to help people, and Dean honored that by keeping it accessible. A donation box by the door collected voluntary contributions that went toward maintaining the workshop and supporting the scholarship fund. Fritz had promoted Dean to assistant manager at the hardware store with a significant raise. "You're good for business," Fritz said with his characteristic directness. "People respect you, trust you. Plus, you actually know what you're talking about when customers need help with complex repairs." The work provided steady income and daily structure, but Dean's heart lived increasingly at the farm. He'd begun documenting Virgil's methods, creating educational materials about independent invention, writing down the story in detail so future generations would have the complete narrative, not just the triumph, but the struggle, the theft, the redemption. Bryn had made changes too. She'd resigned from her pharmaceutical sales position and was exploring opportunities that felt more meaningful. She'd been spending most weekends at the farm, helping Dean develop the educational programming, thinking about how to expand Virgil's legacy beyond just the workshop and scholarship. "I've been thinking about starting a foundation," she said one evening as they sat on the porch watching sunset paint the fields gold. "Something that supports rural innovators, provides resources and protection, so what happened to Virgil doesn't happen to others. We could use the licensing fees from manufacturers who want to produce Virgil's device." Several companies had expressed interest in commercial production. Lawrence was negotiating agreements that ensured affordable pricing for rural communities and funding for the foundation Bryn envisioned. Virgil's invention would finally reach the people he'd designed it to help, while generating resources to support others following similar paths. Dean looked at his daughter, seeing determination that reminded him of her mother. Virgil would love that, using his work to protect other people's work. That's exactly right. They'd grown close again, father and daughter finding their way back to each other through shared purpose. The distance that had seemed insurmountable 6 months ago had closed. Through honest conversation, mutual respect, and the bond created by fighting together for something that mattered. On a warm April morning, Dean commissioned a second plaque for the workshop. He mounted it beside the first, where morning sunlight would illuminate both. The new inscription read, "Dedicated to all the brilliant minds working in obscurity, your contributions matter, your efforts count, your genius deserves recognition. Keep building. Someone will notice. Someone will care." That afternoon, Dean sat in the workshop with Virgil's journal open to the final pages where he'd been adding his own entries. He wrote, "April 20th, 6 months since I started this journey. Virgil's name is restored, his scholarship is funding its first student, his device is moving toward production. The workshop has become a gathering place, a reminder that innovation can happen anywhere, that credentials matter less than dedication. I came to this farm with nothing, no job, no purpose, no hope. Virgil's work gave me all three. More than that, it gave me back my daughter, my sense of worth, my belief that one person can make a difference. To whoever continues this work after me, honor the past, but build toward the future. Virgil showed us how. Now it's our turn to carry it forward." Dean closed the journal and placed it carefully on the shelf where it belonged, not hidden, but preserved, available to anyone who wanted to understand the full story. He looked around the workshop, at the device still humming its steady rhythm, at the walls lined with blueprints and photographs, at the space where Virgil had spent 30 years turning vision into reality. The brass plaques gleamed in afternoon light. Virgil's photograph watched from the wall, with that slight smile, as if he'd known all along that someone would eventually understand, would eventually care, would eventually fight to tell the truth. Dean walked outside into spring sunshine. The fields stretched green and growing. The barn stood straight, repaired, and functional. The farmhouse that had seemed like a cruel joke when he'd won it now felt like home, the place where his life had been restored through honoring another man's legacy. Bryn's car pulled up the driveway. She got out, carrying groceries, waving at her father with genuine happiness on her face. They'd cook dinner together, sit on the porch, talking as stars emerged, make plans for the foundation and the workshop, and all the work still ahead. Dean smiled, feeling contentment settle over him like the warm spring air. Life had given him a worthless farm and turned it into treasure. Loss had transformed into purpose. Isolation had become connection. A $5 raffle ticket had led him to Virgil Keswick, and through Virgil, back to himself. Sometimes endings are beginnings. Sometimes what people throw away is exactly what someone else needs to find. Sometimes justice arrives late but arrives nonetheless. And sometimes, if you're very fortunate, you get the chance to honor a stranger's life and discover your own purpose in the process. The device hummed in the workshop. Virgil's name lived on bronze plaques and scholarship documents. And Dean Halpern, once invisible and defeated, stood on his farm, watching his daughter approach, knowing that he'd done something that mattered. He'd given a forgotten man his rightful place in history, and in doing so, he'd found his own.